A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada ki jai. Jayam Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajacharya Astotara Satta Sri Srimad Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur ki jai. Prem Sikaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Sri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinath Shamakund Radha Kund Giri Govardhan ki jai. Vrindavan Dham ki jai. Mayapur Navadvip Dham ki jai. Ganga Mai Yamuna Mai ki jai. Bhakti Devi Tulsi Maharani ki jai. Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Gaura Premanandi. All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the assembled devotees.
Hare Krishna.
All glories to the lotus feet of Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada.
Hare Bol.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Good morning. Thank you everyone for joining. We continue our study of Srimad Bhagavatam. We're in the third canto of 14th chapter. And this is text 5. And for me, I don't know if it's for everyone, but for me, Veda Base is down, the online version. So here we have the desktop version. That's okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. Maitreya Uvacha Sadhu Vira Tvaya Prishtam Avatara Katam Harehe Yatvam Prichchasi Martyanam Mrityu Pasha Vishatinin. Maitreya Uvacha Sadhu Vira Tvaya Prishtam Avatara Katam Harehe Yatvam Prichchasi Martyanam Mrityu Pasha Vishatanim. Maitreya Uvacha Sadhu Vira Tvaya Prishtam Avatara Katam Harehe Yat Tvam Prichchasi Martyanam Mrityu Pasha Vishatanim. Please chant.
Hare Krishna. Maitreya Uvacha Sadhu Virtvaya Prishtam Avatar Katham Hare Yat Tvam Prichasi Martyana Mrityu Pasha Vishatanum. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Maitreya Uvacha Sadhubhirataya Prishtam Avatara Katham Hare Yattam Prachashi Martayanam Mrittu Pasha Bhishatanim. Hare Krishna.
Maitreya Uvacha Sadhu Viratvaya Prishtam Avatara Katham Hare Yatvam Prichati Martyanam Mrityu Pasha Vishatanim. Hare Krishna.
Maitreya Uvacha Sadhu Viratvaya Prishtham Avatara Katham Hari Yatvam Prichasi Martyanam Mrityupasha Vishatanim.
Maitreya Uvacha Sadhuvira Sadhuvira Tvaya Prishtam Avataram Katam Hare Yatvam Prichasi Martyanam Mrityupasa Vishatanim. Anyone else? Okay. Maitreya Uvacha. Maitreya said, Sadhu, just befitting a devotee. Veera, O warrior. Tvaya, by you. Prishtam, inquired. Avatara Katam, topics on the incarnation of the Lord. Hare, of the personality of Godhead. Yat, that which. Tvam, your good self. Prichasi, asking me. Martyanam, of those who are destined for death. Mrityu Pasha, the chain of birth and death. Vishatanim, source of liberation. Translation by Bhaicharanarvinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The great sage Maitreya said, O warrior, the inquiry made by you is just befitting a devotee because it concerns the incarnation of the personality of Godhead. He is the source of liberation from the chain of birth and death for all those who are otherwise destined to die. Purport. Pardon me. The great sage Maitreya asked Vidura as a warrior, addressed. The great sage Maitreya addressed Vidura as a warrior, not only because Vidura belonged to the Kuru family, but because he was anxious to hear about the chivalrous activities of the Lord in his incarnations of Varaha and Nrsimha. Because the inquiries concerned the Lord, they were perfectly befitting a devotee. A devotee has no taste for hearing anything mundane. There are many topics of mundane warfare, but a devotee is not inclined to hear them. The topics of the warfare in which the Lord engages do not concern the war of death, but the war against the chain of Maya, which obliges one to accept repeated birth and death. In other words, one who takes delight in hearing the war topics of the Lord is relieved from the chains of birth and death. Foolish people are suspicious of Krishna's taking part in the battle of Kurukshetra, not knowing that his taking part ensured liberation for all who were present on the battlefield. It is said by Bhishma Dev that all who were present on the battlefield of Kurukshetra attained their original spiritual existences after death. Therefore, hearing the war topics of the Lord is as good as any other devotional service. Translation again, the great Maitreya said, O warrior, the inquiry made by you is just befitting a devotee because it concerns the incarnation of the personality of Godhead. He is the source of liberation from the chain of birth and death, and for all those who are otherwise destined to die. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminate Ramane Namaste Sarasvate Deve Gauravana Vicharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pashatya Deshatarne Om Ajnana Timirandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpatrubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Eva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. One moment as I readjust my screens here. Okay. Good morning. Thank you all for joining our continued study of Srimad Bhagavatam. So, the topics that we are naturally drawn to say a lot about us, right? Each of us has a unique conditioning. And because of that, we all have various types of topics and activities that we like to discuss. We're just naturally drawn to those types of topics. So it's no surprise that Vidura, being a Kshatriya, Sadhu Vira, um, he's a devotee and a warrior. So it's no surprise that he is relishing hearing about the forms that the Lord takes when he comes to fight the demons. But Vidura's motive in hearing these topics is actually pure because his interest is in hearing about the Lord's pastimes. It's not because it involves war. He wouldn't take equal pleasure in hearing topics of war. He's taking pleasure in the fact that this is about Krishna. And it just so happens that since he's a warrior, it's also going to potentially relate to him, uh, um, or it's going to be a little bit more relatable to him in his experience. But he's a pure devotee, so generally any topic of the Lord is going to uh, uh, excite him. Our motives, on the other hand, are quite mixed. And for now, uh, we tend to be more focused on the externals than the internal. But by engaging our conditioned nature properly in Krishna's service, we can purify our current desires to hear about various types of mundane topics by hearing about those topics as they occur in the pastimes of Krishna and his devotees. Right? This is our process. We uh, understand what our conditioned nature is. We engage that conditioned nature by dovetailing it into Krishna's service. It becomes purified, and then the conditioned nature gradually dissolves away, leaving us only with our constitutional nature. We see things clearly, and then we can properly engage like Vidura is, just in relishing hearing any topic of Krishna. So, although we have these tendencies to hear these mundane topics, and each of us, again, we have our own unique conditioning, so these specific types of topics will vary that we're drawn to. But no matter what types of topics that we are attracted to, the Vedas provide us with those topics, but in relation to how Krishna and his devotees interact. So when we do this, it's a familiar subject matter, but it's in its pure form, and it's thus purifying when properly heard, right? When we engage that in hearing about Krishna's pastimes, right? Even if we're initially drawn to just hearing those pastimes, which sort of relate to our material conditioning, that will gradually purify us to the point where eventually we'll be happy to hear any pastime of the Supreme Lord. And actually, all of our materialistic tendencies can be purified by this process, not just the topics of discussion, but the activities we like to engage in, etc. Whatever we do for entertainment or convenience, any activity can be purified by this exact process. If we're attentive, sincere, and honest with ourselves, this purification process can happen actually quite quickly, right? But that's what it takes. It takes attention. We have to be conscious of what's actually happening. We have to be sincere, guided by the spiritual master, the Shastras, and the sadhus. And we also have to be honest with ourselves. if we consider ourselves to be more advanced than we actually are, uh, then we won't be striving so hard to get better. If we already think we're at the goal, we're not going to try uh, any sort of process to get any further. So it takes attentiveness, so understanding based on Shastra, sincerity, uh, and honesty with ourselves. And this purification process can happen quickly. And that's with any material attachment, right? But today we're going to talk about um, material attachments in the form of topics of discussion that we're drawn to, right? So Vidor didn't have this problem, but we do, right? So we tend to be drawn to certain, depending on our conditioning, certain types of discussions, uh, right? Sometimes we'll note we're in a situation and it's not really our scene. You know, we're doing a friend a favor, we're showing up to something, they're talking about something that doesn't pertain to us, but somehow across the room we hear something that it's part of our realm, and then we get excited and we go and we start talking to that person. Oh, okay, so this person, now I can actually engage in some conversation because all of this other stuff, although words are being said, it relates not at all to me. Right. So we've had experiences of this, I think most of us. And these days, topics of discussion can get quite heated, right? We see that this is going on these days, that they're not just friendly discussions these days. They can get quite passionately heated. And we, aspiring devotees, are sometimes drawn into these passionate discussions, right? We attempt to support the side that seems right to us with support from the Shastra, right? We analyze the situation and we think, okay, let's see what would the proper Vaishnava understanding be of this particular topic that's popular and being debated in a very passionate way. And but then we actually might become surprised that other aspiring devotees, they're doing the same thing, but for the opposing side, right? This is something that we see quite commonly these days, right? In other words, there's a popular argument going on. We figure out what we think the Shastra would guide us to understand in that regard. So we start supporting that argument with what we understand from the Shastra, and then we find out that there are other aspiring devotees that are doing the same thing, but for the other side, and we're thinking, how is that possible philosophically? You know, this is my understanding, and so how could someone be supporting the complete opposite side with the same Shastra, right? And we can become bewildered. And it can actually become difficult to avoid these types of debates and discussions, these heated debates and discussions that are happening these days, because they're presented in such a way that they are applicable to everyone, right? This is about, you can't argue that it has nothing to do with me. They'll say, no, 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 it has to do with everyone. And it's the most important thing right now, right? This is how people present it. And they say, if you don't stand up and speak out, you are part of the problem, right? I'm sure we've all heard that, right? So it's easy to fall into these discussions, to feel the need to engage in these discussions. We even feel duty bound to give a Krishnaized representation of these various popular points of view, right? Before we get further into this, because I really want to dig deep into this, because this is happening. We see it. It's basically our daily lives. We are engaging in these topics of conversation. We feel the need to do it. We feel the need to bring it in line with Shastra. Sometimes we're bewildered when others are trying to also bring it in line with Shastra, but they're saying the opposite thing. So before we get further into it, and this is, again, an important thing to discuss, I want to first read a few quotes from Srila Prabhupada because it's always good to base whatever we're talking about on the instructions of the acharyas instead of basing them on personal experiences, beliefs, philosophies, public opinions, and so on, right? It shouldn't be about just our own sense of morality uh, based on experiences and logic and so on. It should actually be based on the Shastra as presented by the Acharyas, of course, because were it not for the Acharyas, we wouldn't have access to the pure form of the Shastra, right? So they give proper explanations of commonly misunderstood topics. So this first quote of Srila Prabhupada is from a purport, the fifth canto, 12th chapter, verse 13. One of my favorite excerpts of Srila Prabhupada. I've cut and pasted this so many times. He says, the pure devotee is never interested in material topics. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has strictly prohibited his devotees to talk about worldly matters. Gramya varta na kahibe. One should not indulge in talking unnecessarily about news of the material world. One should not waste time in this way. This is a very important feature in the life of a devotee. A devotee has no other ambition than to serve Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This Krishna consciousness movement was started to engage people 24 hours daily in the service of the Lord and his glorification. I always love when Srila Prabhupada starts a sentence with this Krishna consciousness movement was started to, and then dot, dot, dot. I've actually compiled a lot of these. And because this is Srila Prabhupada's purpose. You know, we can look at the 12 purposes of ISKCON. That's also there, I think, in the when the nonprofit was started, the organization was officially started, because I think that had to be included there. But there are also throughout Srila Prabhupada's books, there are these statements like this that also these support, by the way, these 12 names. Is it 12? Anyway, the purposes of ISKCON. So here, this Krishna consciousness movement was started to engage people 24 hours daily in the service of the Lord and his glorification, right? So this is the purpose of this ISKCON movement. Then he continues, the students in this institution engage in the cultivation of Krishna consciousness from 5 in the morning to 10 at night. They actually have, this is my favorite part of the quote, they actually have no opportunity to waste their time unnecessarily by discussing politics, sociology, and current events. These will go their own way. A devotee is concerned only with serving Krishna positively and seriously. The next quote I'm going to read is from the first canto, 5th chapter, verse 10 purport, wherein Srila Prabhupada writes, there are different kinds of literature for different types of men of different mentality. Mostly the market literatures contained refused remnants of sensuous topics. They are generally known as mundane talks in relation with the gross body and subtle mind. They are full of subject matter, described in decorative language, full of mundane similes and metaphorical arrangements. Yet with all that, they do not glorify the Lord. Such poetry and prose on any subject matter is considered decoration of a dead body. Spiritually advanced men do not take pleasure in such dead literatures, which are sources of pleasure for men who are spiritually dead. These literatures in the modes of passion and ignorance are distributed under different labels, but they can hardly help the spiritual urge of the human being, and thus the spiritually advanced men have nothing to do with them. Right? They're geared toward people who are attracted by other things. But those who are spiritually advanced, they have nothing to do with them. Such spiritually advanced men always keep up the standard of transcendental voluntary service to the Lord on the spiritual plane. This completely forbids fruitive activities for gross bodily sense satisfaction or subtle speculation on the material egoistic mind. The next one is from also the first canto, the 16th chapter, verse 5 purport, where Srila Prabhupada writes, anything that is dovetailed with the narration of Krishna is worth hearing. There are many topics in the Bhagavatam about sociology, politics, economics, cultural affairs, and so on, but all of them are in relation with Krishna, and therefore all of them are worth hearing. Krishna is the purifying ingredient in all matters, regardless of what they are. In the mundane world, everything is unpure due to its being a product of the three mundane qualities. The purifying agent, however, is Krishna. Right? So this quote helps us to understand that it's not that devotees aren't drawn to talking about sociology, politics, economics, cultural affairs, and so on. It's that when they do so, it's only in relation to Krishna's pastimes. They're not attracted to hearing about or speaking about them separately. They're interested in hearing about, okay, what does Krishna do in these situations? Krishna and his devotees, how do they deal with these issues? Right? And that's the purifying agent. We may be attracted to hearing about them because of our material conditioning, because we like to hear about politics or economics or how society should be interacting properly. But if we think about these things only in terms of the material realm and we don't understand them in their pure sense, then we're going to be here in this material realm for quite a long time, many, many births. The next quote, it's from the very next purport. It's still in the first canto, 16th chapter. This is from verse 6. This is a continuation, basically, of this idea. The battle of Kurukshetra is full of politics and diplomacy, but because the topics are related with Lord Krishna, the Bhagavad Gita is therefore adored all over the world. There's no need to eradicate politics, economy, sociology, and so on, which are mundane to the mundaners. To a pure devotee who is actually related with the Lord, such mundane things are transcendental if dovetailed with the Lord or his pure devotees. Let's do two more. We're going to do two more of these quotes from Srila Prabhupada. This one is from the second canto, third chapter, verse 12, purport. It says, the natural consequence of hearing such Harikatha, right? So what's the purpose of hearing Harikatha, right? So the natural consequence automatically happens is attainment of transcendental knowledge, which causes detachment from all mundane topics for which a devotee has no taste at all, right? So eventually we won't even have a taste for these mundane topics, right? Because we'll have such an attachment to transcendental knowledge. This is the natural consequence of diverting our tendency to want to hear to hearing Hari Katha, of course, with the proper consciousness. For a devotee, all mundane activities, social and political, become unattractive. Means not even drawn into hearing about them, right? Let alone joining in with that discussion. And then the last one, same canto, same chapter, verse 20 purport. So 2, 3, 20 purport. If the ear is not engaged in the service of the Lord by hearing about him from the Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam, certainly the holes of the ear will be filled with some rubbish. Therefore, the messages of the Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam should be preached all over the world very loudly. Here's a very important sentence coming up. That is the duty of a pure devotee who has actually heard about them from the perfect sources. I'll read that sentence again. that is the duty of a pure devotee who has actually heard about them from perfect sources, right? So, in other words, Srila Prabhupada is saying, since we've had the great fortune of hearing these transcendental subject matters, uh, we are obligated to share that with the rest of the world who are also interested in hearing about these things. Um, but if they hear about them in the context of Krishna's pastimes, then it's actually going to purify them. Continuing the quote, many want to speak something to others, right? It's natural. But because they are not trained to speak on the subject matter of Vedic wisdom, they are all speaking nonsense, and people are receiving them with no sense. There are hundreds and thousands of sources for distributing mundane news of the world, and people of the world are also receiving it. Similarly, the people of the world should be taught to hear the transcendental topics of the Lord, and the devotee of the Lord must speak loudly so that they can hear. Right? So it's not that the devotees just join in with whatever conversation's happening, right? The devotees have the privilege of understanding all topics in relation to Krishna's service, right? So this is what our duty should be, right? Our duty as those who have actually heard about these from perfected sources should be to broadcast this message very loudly, as Srila Prabhupada adds. Continuing, the frogs loudly croak, with the result that they invite the snakes to eat them. The human tongue is especially given for chanting of Vedic hymns, not for croaking like frogs, right? So the idea is that we may be quite proud of that which we are spewing, right? Whatever topics that we're speaking of, we may think that, they're coming from a place that's intellectually enriched, or backed by a lot of personal experience. But if it's not in connection with the Supreme Lord, all that talking is doing is inviting our death, just like a frog croaking. He's very proud of his croaking. It's just allowing the snake to understand, oh, the frog is over here. Okay, now I go and have my meal, right? So when we're using our natural tendency to speak, if we're not engaging that in Krishna's service, then we're engaging it in materialism, which means we're going to be bound to the material world. So those were some quotes from Srila Prabhupada's purports. There are some people, for whatever reason, that when they hear instructions like this, they would rather hear it directly from the text of Shastra. They consider maybe when the Acharya gives an explanation, it might be tainted by their previous material conditioning, or it may be adjusted for preaching purposes. I've heard things like this. So if there are any of those types of people here, um, I'll give quotes directly from the Srimad Bhagavatam as well. And these are even if you're already completely convinced by what Srila Prabhupada said, which we should be, it's always fun to hear directly from the Bhagavatam as well. Of course, anytime an Acharya speaks, they're just paraphrasing what's given in other parts of the Shastra that relate to this particular part of the Shastra. That's the duty of the Acharya, and that's what they do. So this first one, and no surprise, these will actually be the verses which I was just reading the purports to. So this first one is 5, 12, 13. Who are the pure devotees mentioned here? In an assembly of pure devotees, there is no question of discussing material subjects like politics and sociology. In an assembly of pure devotees, there is discussion only of the qualities, forms, and pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He is praised and worshipped with full attention. In the association of pure devotees, by constantly hearing such topics respectfully, even a person who wants to merge into the existence of the absolute truth abandons this idea and gradually becomes attached to the service of Vasudeva. Right? So even impersonalists who we know, it's dangerous to even hear the words coming out of the mouth of an impersonalist. But if an impersonalist finds themselves in the association of devotees who are only speaking Hari Katha, they will naturally become attached to the service of Vasudeva. 5, 12, 13. This next one, it's 2 verses. These are very famous verses. Srila Prabhupada quoted them a lot. His disciples quote them a lot, so these should sound familiar. This is first canto, 5th chapter, verses 10 and 11. Those words which do not describe the glories of the Lord, who alone can sanctify the atmosphere of the whole universe, are considered by saintly persons to be like unto a place of pilgrimage for crows. Since the all-perfect persons are inhabitants of the transcendental abode, they do not derive any pleasure there. On the other hand, that literature which is full of descriptions of the transcendental glories of the name, fame, form, pastimes, and so on of the unlimited Supreme Lord is of a different creation, full of transcendental words directed toward bringing about a revolution in the impious lives of this world's misdirected civilization. Such transcendental literatures, even though imperfectly composed, are heard, sung, and accepted by purified men who are thoroughly honest. Right? So these topics of the Supreme Lord, the pastimes, name, form, and so on, they're full of transcendental words, and they're directed toward bringing about a revolution in the impious lives of this world's misdirected civilization. Right? This is what they're meant for. Right? So these days we are trying to bring about a revolution in society, right? We see so many things that are going wrong. But if we aren't referring to these transcendental words, which are directed to do this, to bring about this revolution, if we're only dealing with a material solution, we're only discussing these things, if we're engaging in these discussions just in an external sense, then it's just decorations on a dead body, right? Uh, we'll continue with the quotes before I elaborate further. Let's see. Actually, due to time, I'm going to skip a couple of these. There are so many great quotes. That's the point. This isn't something that is occasionally mentioned. It's there. I'll do one more and then we'll continue. This one is second canto, 3rd chapter, verse 20. One who has not listened to the messages about the prowess and marvelous acts of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and has not sung or chanted loudly the worthy songs about the Lord, is to be considered to possess ear holes like the holes of a snake and tongue like the tongue of a frog. So the instruction's clear, right? We are to abandon our attachment to mundane topics and to focus exclusively on topics of Krishna, right? That's the clear instruction. But we do have material conditioning, right? We have these tendencies. We're naturally attracted to hearing these topics, right? And we're naturally inclined to try to be a part of the solution to the major problems that are happening, right? But the instruction's clear. But don't despair. If you're attached to mundane topics, it's okay. We're in the material world. It shouldn't be a surprise, right? It shouldn't be a surprise that we had material conditioning. That's no problem. Nothing to be ashamed of unless we continue to cultivate that mundane attachment. But if we want to gradually bring that material attachment under control, and that's what this process of Krishna consciousness is about, by the mercy of the pure devotees, there is a way, even if we are attached to hearing and discussing these mundane topics. And here it is. So here's another quote. Srimad Bhagavatam 3, 5, 12, and this gives us hope. It says, Krishna Dvaipayana Vyas has already described the transcendental qualities of the Lord in his great work, the Mahabharata. But the whole idea of the Mahabharata is to draw the attention of the mass of people to Krishna Katha through their strong affinity for hearing mundane topics, right? So it's no problem that we have a strong affinity for hearing mundane topics, right? We can still hear Hari Katha and satisfy our affinity for hearing mundane topics, right? We can hear about politics, diplomacy, sociology, all of these things, but in relation to Krishna's pastimes. And when we hear them in that way, not only do we see the proper way to deal in these matters, right, in these political situations, but we understand the personality of Krishna and his devotees and how they're always willing to go out of their way to serve the higher purpose, right? Not just establishing right from wrong, but establishing material from spiritual, right? So when we read these things, not only are we going to satisfy our strong affinity for hearing mundane topics, but we're also going to be making spiritual advancement. So if we have this strong affinity, fret not, but direct your affinity toward works like Mahabharata or Srimad Bhagavatam, depending on what our conditioning is attracting us to the topics. We can find those exact topics in Krishna's pastimes, and we can purify those. In his purport to that verse, the verse that I just read, 3.5.12, Srila Prabhupada writes, misguided persons who are interested in the mundane affairs of philanthropic and altruistic work, under the misconception of the body as the self, could better take advantage of the Mahabharata, which was specifically compiled by Srila Vyasadeva for their benefit, right? That's exactly what it was compiled for. And one might say, but philanthropic and altruistic work, that sounds nice, right? That's good, isn't it? Right? Materially, it is pious. As far as a materialistic philosophy is concerned, it's good. But as Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu points out in Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita, the concept of good and bad in this material world is actually just bad because it pertains to this temporary material world, and we are eternal beings. So although there is a better and a worse within this material world, it's all bad. The ultimate benefit is to get out of the material world. And so those who are interested in these affairs of philanthropic and altruistic work, Srila Vyasadeva has specifically given us Mahabharata so that we can purify that desire of engaging in these topics of discussion, and help us bring our attraction from these mundane topics to actual spiritual transcendental topics. Srila Prabhupada continues that purport. The great author has compiled the Mahabharata in such a way that the less intelligent class of men who are more interested in mundane topics, that's us, may read the Mahabharata with great relish and in the course of such mundane happiness, meaning we're going to get mundane enjoyment from hearing about the intrigues of, diplomacy and all those things. So that's going to be fed. But they can also take advantage of hearing the story of Bhagavad Gita, which occurs in the Mahabharata, which is the preliminary study of Srimad Bhagavatam or the Vedanta Sutra. Srila Vyasadeva had no interest in writing a history of mundane activities other than to give the less intelligent persons a chance for transcendental realization through Bhagavad Gita, right? Otherwise, he would have no purpose to write about all this political intrigue, right? And espionage and all these things. But since people are attracted to it, then he gave these literatures to engage that material attraction in the service of Krishna so that we can actually purify it and reveal our true natural attraction, which is for Krishna, right? One more quote. This is 10th canto, chapter 90, verse 50. I think chapter 90 is Prayers of the Personified Vedas, if I'm not mistaken, unless that's 89. By regularly hearing, chanting, and meditating on the beautiful topics of the Lord Mukunda, with ever-increasing sincerity, a mortal being will attain the divine kingdom of the Lord, where the inviolable power of death holds no sway. For this purpose, many persons, including great kings, abandoned their mundane homes and took to the forest. Right? So just hearing about these activities. This is the only solution to material conditioning. And so knowing this, even great kings, right? You would think a king, right? They're in control of so many things. They have so much potency. But when we read Bhumi Gita in Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhumi's Mother Earth personified is talking about these great kings and emperors who, not even their own lifetime, but the lifetimes of their whole dynasty was successful because they established the principles in such a firm way that even in their absence, their potency was still understood in the world. But from Bhumi's point of view, from Mother Earth's point of view, even though you're going beyond a human lifetime, you're going through thousands of years, a whole dynasty, still that's a blink of an eye, in the grand scheme of things, right? So even these great kings who had control, they had power, they had the ability to make the material situation better for all of the praja. Still, they understood that, yeah, but even if we make the material situation better, there's still the problem of birth, death, disease, and old age. There's still the problem of misidentification. There will not be satisfaction in this material world, right? And so they abandon their kingdom. It's called a mundane home in this verse, right? But it's a kingdom. They abandoned it and took to the forest because they understood that a material topic, no matter how good it is, even if you go to the heavenly planets, you have a very long life. It's all very pious. Everyone is nicely engaged, cooperating. There's not so much quarrel. There's a little bit, but not so much. It's tolerable. It's quite nice, but it's temporary, right? Even in the material heavenly planets, life is temporary, right? And one has to earn that through pious deeds in the lower, it means the middle planetary systems, right? Lower than the heavenly planets. So this is the conclusion that only these topics, which actually help one transcend the material bondage, only those are actually worth hearing, discussing. So earlier I mentioned that one of the reasons that we find ourselves drawn into these, or even duty bound to take part in these various subject matters, these topics of discussion, is because we consider that if you don't stand up and speak out, you're part of the problem, right? And there's some truth to that. Uh, as it generally happens, we tend to get a bit distracted by the details and lose sight of the principle, right? So although there's some truth to it, uh, if we're distracted by the details and not understanding the principle, then we will find ourselves in a very precarious situation. It is certainly our duty as recipients of the mercy of Srila Prabhupada and his sincere followers to contribute to the solution of the problems of this material world, right? Srila Prabhupada said it right there in the purport that it is our duty to help people that are suffering in the material world. But the only solution is actually to transcend the material world, not to make a better material situation, right? And the only way to do that, to transcend the material world, is to purify our senses by engaging in the loving service of the master of the senses, Hrishikesha. If we just try to make the material situation better, or in most cases, we're just actually making it slightly worse. I mean, slightly less worse. That's not proper English, but you know what I mean. We aren't truly solving anything, right? This is the material world. It by definition is full of problems. And this being Kali Yuga means that they're big problems and they're going to get worse. Absolutely, right? This is explained to us. These things will go their own way, as Srila Prabhupada mentioned. The real problem is that we are eternal beings in a temporary place, which means the real solution is to purify our polluted consciousness that's identifying as this external body, so that we can properly identify as the eternal spirit soul, right? purify our conditioning so we can reveal our constitutional nature. And naturally, we can have compassion to help others in this endeavor, right? It's not just about us, we can also help others. But if we're caught up in the mundane details, then we can't really help, right? A bound man cannot save another bound man. That's the idea. When we focus on the external details, we're actually assigning more power or value to matter than we are to spirit, right? We're giving it more importance. If we think, well, no, but this is the matter at hand, this is what we have to discuss, we're actually implying that uh, we have to put the talk of spiritual discussions on the back burner for now because this is more important, right? So we're putting more emphasis or more power or value on matter than we are spirit, right? Although we can certainly explain the process of spirituality to others by referring to some familiar material experience or phenomenon so that they can more easily relate to it, the focus has to be on the spiritual principle, right? It always has to be there. Again, sometimes we'll speak of it in terms of material situations just so people can understand what we're talking about. But if we lose sight or we lose connection to that spiritual principle, then we're just engaging in material conversations, which will not have any solution. Even if it's a temporary solution, it's not an ultimate solution. So it's true. If we're not part of the solution, we are part of the problem, right? And we have the privilege of knowing that the only solution to material problems is to transcend it by the process of bhakti. So if we're wasting our time engaging in debates about material problems with so-called material solutions, we are actually very much part of the problem, right? We're making it worse if that's what we're doing. So just to conclude, today's a very quote heavy discussion. Sometimes I just paraphrase these types of things, but sometimes it's also nice to hear them in their context so we know that it's coming from a position of authority. So to conclude, I want to read one more quote. This is just about nonviolence. So in chapter 10 of Bhagavad Gita, verses 4 and 5, there's a whole list of nice qualities. One of them is nonviolence. And this is Srila Prabhupada's elaboration on what nonviolence means. And this pertains to what we discussed today. So in that purport, Srila Prabhupada writes, Ahimsa, nonviolence, means that one should not do anything which will put others into misery or confusion. Material activities that are promised by so many politicians, sociologists, philanthropists, and so on do not produce very good results because the politicians and philanthropists have no transcendental vision. They do not know what is actually beneficial for human society. Ahimsa means that people should be trained in such a way that the full utilization of the human body can be achieved. The human body is meant for spiritual realization. So any movement or any commissions which do not further that end commit violence on the human body. That which furthers the future spiritual happiness of the people in general is called nonviolence. So true nonviolence is actually only feeding the soul, right? If we're focusing on the external, it's actually violence because then a solution can't actually be achieved. So let's stop there and see if anyone wants to add to this discussion or if there are any questions. We can do that. But it's a common thing these days. We're very much attracted to, and again, we feel duty bound to participating in these very heated discussions. And we have to be careful that we're making sure that we're not just referring to Shastra to support our material claim, but that we're actually understanding the principle that's given in the Shastra. And the best way to purify our tendency to engage in these different subject matters is to pull ourselves away from the mundane representations of it and understand these things in relation to Krishna's pastimes by reading Srimad Bhagavatam, uh, Mahabharata, etc. And in that way, we can understand the principle. Then we can actually better assist those who are struggling trying to solve these problems in a material way. Anything from anyone?
Hey, Krishna
Vrindavan?
Prabhu. Yes, I
Right.
will. It's always nice to hear your perspectives and also just the sharing of the verses that you provided. I think were, really help to illustrate for us how that we should be, focusing on kata. And I was, I think I was speaking with a more senior devotee yesterday, and I was just thinking about, right at the stage, very low stage that I'm in right now. It's for me, it's like I'm struggling to just try and remember Krishna, right? So I'm trying to clear my life out enough to even make space for that. And and it was something we were just sharing is how to in our day-to-day lives, like create space for that and clear our minds. And so I just would to share that and see if you had some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We do need to, because again, we shouldn't be surprised or even be overwhelmed by the fact that we have material attachments and tendencies towards material topics. But we should be able to at least distinguish or at least recognize that we have those attachments. Because the danger is that we become under the illusion that since we do have a connection to Krishna, we have this tendency to think that because of that connection, because we interact with the devotees and we know a little bit from Shastra, that we're just on some higher platform and that we're not affected by these mundane topics, that we can actually engage in them without being affected. And that's a dangerous position to be in. Um, but if we do, as you said, make space, create time to uh, focus on the Shastra. And again, at first, it can just be those parts of Shastra that actually appeal to our mundane, conditioned attachments, right? So if we're interested in political discussions, then Mahabharata is great, or parts of the Srimad Bhagavatam that also deal with diplomacy and things like that. Very good. And that will help actually bring us in line with understanding not just the detail, but the principle of it. Because the principle of it is to understand what our eternal relationship is with Krishna, that we are part and parcel of him, that we have the same qualities, eternal qualities as him, but in a very different quantity. And so therefore, he is the supreme person. And if we're coming to that conclusion, then we're automatically going to start behaving properly. We're going to start making the right choices, right? Because I'm not as important as I thought I was. There's still a great deal of importance, but it's not in this uh, material body that I've been identifying with, whether the gross body or the subtle body, the material intelligence, etc. When we start to see what our true nature is, the nature of the soul, we start uncovering that, right? We start peeling away the material conditioning and our true nature starts being revealed. Then it becomes quite easy, actually. But most of us are in this position where that's not where we're not on that platform. We're on a platform where we still have a lot of material attachments, and it shows. Um, but we think that we're using them properly because at least we're referring to scripture sometimes when we're trying to prove our point, right? But if that's how we're approaching Shastra, just to find something to support what we think is right, instead of trying to understand what is right by giving more time um, reading and understanding Shastra through inquiring submissively to the Guru and uh, observing the examples that the sadhus give in their daily lives, if we're putting more time and effort in understanding a material problem and not how to solve it in the spiritual way, then we're not going to be doing very well. So as often as possible, for some people that can mean, 10 minutes a day. For some people that can mean an hour. For some people that can mean 20 hours in the day, focusing more on the Shastra so that they can become well equipped to deal with what's being what the hot topic is, right? There's a quote. This quote, it's been credited to so many people. I've heard it was Abraham Lincoln. There's so many different people have said this, and it's true. And the quote is this: "If you give me 7 hours to cut down a tree, I will spend 6 hours sharpening the axe." Right? Because if we have a sharp tool, then the job is quite easy. It can be done with very little effort. But if we try to chop down a tree with a dull axe, so much more effort is going to be in cutting down that tree than what would be to sharpen the axe. The axe is what does the cutting, right? And so you let the tool do the work, right? So in the same way, we have to sharpen our actual intelligence, not our material intelligence, but sharpen our actual intelligence by studying the Shastra under the guidance of the expert guidance of the spiritual master, and through sadhu sangha, understand how to apply all of that knowledge properly. And therefore, when these topics come up, naturally we'll understand the principle of what's going on, and we can discuss them in a way that we're not attached to them and we're not being bound by the concomitant results of being engaging in a material discussion, right? So if we see that we're spending more time and effort on trying to solve the problem through our own, previous experiences or understandings of, if we see we're spending more time in doing that than actually sharpening our intelligence by approaching Shastra in a submissive way, and praying for it to be revealed to us, not asking Shastra to provide further evidence that the point that I'm currently supporting is right, but approaching Shastra to actually understand what is right. Am I right to think that this is the way it is, or is it possible that I'm wrong? Because there's other devotees that are supporting the other side, and they're also quoting Shastra. So should I double down and just say my points louder, or should I get a deeper understanding and see how, yeah, generally there is the way to see it the way that I'm seeing it, supported by Shastra, but there's also the other way, and so there must be some sort of explanation of a higher principle. And the higher principle is you can't solve a material problem. You can't take one side or the other materially, because material means problem, right? So we have to get down to the principle of the matter. And no matter what we're talking about, whether it's a discussion or an activity, right? The very same activity can be done with proper consciousness or improper consciousness, right? And the result's going to be what our consciousness is. If we have a material consciousness, we're going to get a material result, even if we think we're engaging in Krishna service, right? I could be sweeping the temple room, service to Krishna, right? But if my consciousness, my mentality, my drive is material, right? I want people to notice how nicely the temple looks for once. It's usually, disheveled, things are out of place, there's dust, you go to off-road basin season, you start sneezing. And so I want people to notice that and say, oh, it was because of this Prabhu that did that. And oh, he's the best cleaner. Now we should, start a standard, right? Maybe that's my motivation. And if it is, if my motivation isn't just to please Krishna and his devotees, then I'm going to get a material result, right? So the very same thing can be used either way, right? Depending on the consciousness. So we need to understand that and apply that and stop fighting with one another about what detail is best. If we understand what the principle is, we will understand that under certain circumstances, a different detail will be proper for each situation. Is that all right?
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. That's actually even more than yeah, it was a great explanation. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, but we do have to make time for that. And what we do, if we're honest with ourselves, we just pay attention to how much time do I spend cultivating this, preparing myself to engage in this conversation, but without actually referring to Shastra in the proper mood. And how much time am I actually trying to fully understand the detail? Now, if we do that, we're going to realize that, oh, haven't done it on purpose, but I have placed more value on matter than I have on spirit. And if we're honest with ourselves, then we can say, okay, now I want to place more emphasis on spirit, because spirit's superior to matter. It's the only way to get out of it, right? So if we're honest with ourselves and we do that approach and we make more time to cultivate spiritual knowledge in the right way, not in the way where we're trying to justify our material conditioning, but we're trying to understand the actual spiritual solution. The more time we put in doing that in the proper way, again, submissively inquiring to the spiritual master, actually engaging in sadhu sangha, understanding, recognizing that sat principle that is showing through in their reactions, identifying with that and cultivating it within ourselves. That's what sadhu sangha means, actually relating to that sat principle. If we do that, then sure, we can engage in these discussions without attachment. We can give the importance of a spiritual solution over a material one. And if people listen, great. If they don't, no problem, because that's what we're meant to do. We're meant to present spirituality in a detached way, right? Anything else? Okay. So then we can stop here. I thank you all for joining. Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda ki jai.
Vanchakalpatarubhya
Kripa Sindhubhya
Patitanam
Patitanam
Pavanebhyo
Pavanebhyo
Vaishnavibhyo
Vaishnavebhyo
Namo
Namo
Namaha.
Namaha. Thank you,
Thank
Chair
you very
Chandra
much.
Prabhu.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
nice
you.
class.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it.